Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class.
Good morning.
And hey, Brian. So as you can see, I've got some handouts on your seats there, and today's topic we're going to be talking about is cultural practices on lawn care. Now, what we do is typically we do a lot of applications. We do fertilizers, we do pesticides, we also do seeding and things like that. And cultural practices more or less refers to all of the things that are not chemical. Okay, and that actually comprises probably the vast majority of what you want to do on a home lawn is cultural, not chemical. Okay, the chemical stuff that we do is a small part of overall lawn maintenance. So it's important to kind of think about these things and understand the other aspects of lawn maintenance, whether we do it like seeding, that would be cultural, or if somebody else is going to do it. Okay, so here are just a few of them right off the top here. We got water management, mowing, leaf cleanup, aeration, seeding, fertilizing, air circulation, drainage, traffic management. That means if kids or dogs are running around on the lawn a lot, that would be a cultural thing that you need to deal with. Top dressing the lawn. Those are all things that are under the cultural, some of which we do, some of which we don't do, but at the very least we can be able to advise people in the right way once we understand what's going on. So today I just picked out two of them that we're going to talk about. And we'll have other presentations on some of the other ones. Okay, so two of them we're going to focus on today are thatch and temperatures. Okay, two things to think about that we do not deal with when we're using fertilizers or pesticides. So let's start with thatch. What is thatch? I know we've talked about this before in the past, but it's that dead layer sort of in between the blades of the grass and the soil. Starts piling up. You can see it right there. That's not soil. That's not living nice green grass or anything. That's this layer that just starts to build up. And I'm sure all you guys have seen that on lawns before. Maybe you go and you got a dead spot and you go to seed it and it's just all this dead, thick, hard grass that was once probably looking good, but not anymore. Now it's that stuff. Okay, that's thatch. What's that, Dave?
You find mostly when you're weaseling. Yeah,
when you're weaseling, when you're trying to seed areas, and it's just like, I mean, you can't get the machine through it. It's tough. So that's what thatch is. So what's the problem with thatch? What do we deal? Or first off, what's it caused by? Let's talk about that, okay? So it's not caused by grass clippings, which is something that a lot of people think. Okay, you'll hear a lot of even landscapers. There's a lot of information online, and that makes sense because a lot of times you cut the grass, you leave the clippings on the grass, and then what? After a couple of years of this, you've got this dead layer down there. It makes sense that people might think that's from all the clippings that got left there and they piled up over the years. But really, grass clippings don't contribute to the thatch layer much at all, if at all, because they're about 90% water, or 95% water, I think. If I'm doing that off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's about that. They break down completely, okay? And they actually, leaving the clippings on the lawn, as long as it's not like this. You can see there's way too many clippings here. It's good to get those off the lawn when it's like that, because that's going to suffocate the grass. But the clippings break down and return nutrients to the grass, and it's actually a very good thing to leave the clippings. They're not going to make the thatch layer. Okay, that's not the problem with thatch. What causes the thatch layer? Yeah, Rich?
If you leave heavy clipping and it suffocates, will that create thatch?
Not really, no, because what you're going to do is not any more than what's already going to be there. You're going to have some dead grass underneath, but most of that dead grass is going to be more clippings like the blades of the grass that are just going to break down. But the parts of the grass that create thatch are going to be there to create the thatch. And that's what I was going to talk about here. We've got a couple of different things. Stolons, we've talked about these before. Those are like the shoots that go sideways. They crawl on the surface of the ground and spread the grass and pop up new grass plants. Okay, and then you have rhizomes, which are pretty much the same thing. The stolons are above ground. The rhizomes are below ground. Otherwise, they're almost the same thing. But each grass species, for whatever reason, has either rhizomes or stolons. There's a few species that we don't really use that have both, but for the most part, it's one or the other. Grasses that have stolons are usually, whoops, let me go back for a sec. Grasses that have stolons are usually called creeping because they creep along the ground. So if you guys have heard of creeping bent grass, that's one of the grasses that we have in lawns that we'll see. That's because it has stolons. Okay, there's also creeping red fescue. There's other creeping grasses. Some grasses have stolons. They're not called creeping, but if you ever see the word creeping somewhere, that means that it has stolons. Okay, and then rhizomes are underground. And then you have those, and then you have the roots. And these are, for lack of a better term, sort of woodier. They're harder than the grass blades. The grass blades are really, flimsy, and they're mostly water. Those parts are much tougher. And those, over the years, as the grass spreads, they continually pile up one on top of another until eventually you've got that thatch layer. And as they die off, they just don't decompose very quickly. It's kind of like if you have a log from a tree sitting out in your yard. Eventually that's going to break down and decompose, but it's going to be years, right? It's not going to happen quickly. And that's what happens. These rhizomes and stolons and even the roots a little bit just kind of keep piling up on each other over the years and end up creating that thatch layer that we don't want. So what's the problem with thatch, though? Why is it a big deal? Okay. It's got a lot of problems. It acts kind of like a sponge, where it soaks up water. Okay, so you have that thick layer of those things. The water comes down and it soaks it up. Now I want you to think about it for a second. When you use a sponge like this, first off, when it's dry, it's kind of hard to get it wet. Right? You run under the water. At first, the water just kind of runs off. It doesn't actually go into it. But then after you keep it under the water for a little while, finally it starts to soak in, and then it soaks in, and okay, now you got the sponge and it's nice and wet. But then if you turn off the water, what happens to the water in that sponge? It just stays there. It doesn't come out, right? So that's what's happening in the thatch layer. First thing it does is it actually repels water. So when it starts to rain or you got an irrigation system going, the water kind of hits it, and if you're on a slope or something, it oftentimes just runs off and doesn't even get down into the soil. Now, if once it does soak in, after it's being watered for a little while, it'll actually start to get wet and it'll soak, but then it'll soak up the water just like a sponge, and then it'll hold on to it. So the water never gets down into the soil, which is where the roots are and which is where the grass needs it. So you can see right there, it totally interrupts the water flow, and that creates a lot of problems for the grass. And because it's interrupting the water flow, it does kind of the same thing with the fertilizers. The fertilizers get stuck right in that thatch layer. They just don't get soaked down to the roots all that much. So the grass doesn't get the fertilizers we're putting down. Okay? Same thing goes with any other pest control products that we might be putting down. Anybody have any idea what these little guys are? Want to take a crack at it? It's a little harder to see in here, but they're kind of reddish in this picture.
Look like little bugs and the droppings.
Yeah, those are actually called sclerotia. And sclerotia is the technical scientific term for fungus. It's basically the fruiting bodies of fungus. Okay, so the fungus... Sclerotia? Sclerotia. Yeah, sclerotia. And what they are, the fungus, when it goes to reproduce, it's a method of actually survival. And over the winter what happens is the fungus survives in these little shells, these little sort of beads that it makes for itself. Not every fungus does this, but a lot of them do. A lot of the ones that cause diseases on the lawns do this. And these sclerotia need a place to stay to protect them from the elements. And the thatch layer provides a perfect situation. It's kind of like a nest where they're protected from the elements, so you get a nice freezing cold winter. They actually stay in the thatch layer and they can survive till the next year, where when the weather conditions get right, they break open, the fungus spreads, and you start getting disease problems. Okay, so when you've got a thatch layer, it's like a nest. It's protecting these pathogens, these things that are going to cause problems on the lawn for the next year. That's one reason why it's no good. So we've got the water problems, then we've got the problem with it protecting the sclerotia for the fungus so that you're going to get diseases next year, and same thing with insects. That there's a sod webworm. Okay, that is a bunch of chinch bugs, and that's an armyworm, just different types of insect problems that you might run into in lawns. And again, they need a place to survive cold winters and rough weather and stuff like that, and the thatch is the perfect spot. So you leave a good thick thatch layer on the ground. Not only is it preventing water and nutrients and things like that from getting down to the soil, but it's protecting all of these pathogens, the insects and the fungus and the things that are going to cause problems on the lawn. So it doesn't do a whole lot of good, really. It just doesn't, it's not something that we want to allow. So the question is, how can we control it? What can you do to keep it under control? The first thing is aeration. Okay, that's one of the big reasons why we talk about aeration, why we do it on most of our client lawns in the fall at least, sometimes in the spring. And it's one of the reasons why it's a very important part of our program, because we need to keep that thatch layer under control. Otherwise, down the line, just problems really get worse and worse and worse. They just spiral out of control. When you have a thatch layer, you got that up here, okay, and then you also have compacted soil and things like that. But as you can see, when you punch the holes from aeration, what does it do? It takes out a chunk of the thatch and it opens up a nice channel so that the water and the nutrients can now get down into the soil. Right? So it's not every single spot in the lawn, wherever you've got a hole, but you've taken out a plug of thatch and you've opened up a nice spot where water and nutrients can now get down into the soil nice and quickly. And that water and nutrients, when it goes down through that hole, it's going to spread around all around, so you're going to have it kind of throughout. All right? The other thing that it does, and it's not really demonstrated in this picture here, but the other thing it does is when you pull the plug out of the ground, it brings some soil up with it, right? You get those cores on the ground. In the soil is a lot of microbes, and microbes naturally are what decompose plant parts. So when plants die and they break down and decompose, that's because the microbes are feeding on them and decomposing it. Okay, it doesn't. If you had a perfectly sterile environment, they wouldn't decompose, they wouldn't break down. You need the microbes to do that. So when you bring the plugs to the surface, you're bringing a lot of these microbes to the surface, and then when you drag the lawn, you're kind of breaking up those soil cores, and you're getting soil on top of the thatch. Okay, so now you have the soil underneath it that's natural there, then you have the soil on top of it, and you have the microbes in the soil on both sides, and now you've got microbes feeding on the thatch from both ends. So it speeds up, it basically makes the thatch naturally decompose twice as quickly. Okay, so that's why it's important to bring soil to the surface. Sometimes places, instead of aerating, or in addition to aerating, they'll actually top dress, where they'll bring out topsoil and spread it out on a thin layer. We do this sometimes with compost on lawns that need a lot more organic matter. But that top dressing of soil on the surface helps to eat the thatch layer and get it under control. Another way you can keep thatch under control is by mixing up the varieties of grass that you're using. Okay, certain types of grass make thatch because if you remember, what we talked about is that the thatch is produced by the stolons and the rhizomes. Okay, so certain types of grass that have stolons and rhizomes will create a thatch layer, but you do have other types of grass like perennial ryegrass and tall fescue that don't really spread with stolons and rhizomes. So they're not going to make, if you had a lawn that was pure perennial ryegrass, which is a very bad idea by the way, but let's just pretend for a minute that you had a lawn that was pure perennial ryegrass, you would never get a thatch problem on that lawn because there's no rhizomes or stolons spreading to create a problem. Okay, so that's a benefit of perennial ryegrass, but it's still not a good idea to have a pure perennial ryegrass lawn. But mixing it in with the seed blend will help to keep thatch from getting out of control. On the other hand, sod, pure sod that we use up here is Kentucky bluegrass usually. And Kentucky bluegrass has rhizomes and it spreads, and you're going to get thatch buildup because it's 100% Kentucky bluegrass usually. Now it's beautiful, it's great looking stuff, but you need to keep in mind that that sod is going to produce a very bad thatch layer within a few years of putting it down, and aerating it every single year is going to help keep that under control so it doesn't become a problem. And in many cases you do run into, situations where somebody got their lawn sodded and they didn't quite understand that, and then when you propose a maintenance plan to them, they're kind of shocked because they were thinking sod is sort of like instant lawn, you don't even have to take care of it. Some people have that for some reason, they have that in mind. But in reality, sod, you have to aerate that every year. And ideally, integrate some other types of seed in there to give it a little bit more variety so it's not pure Kentucky blue. Okay? You can also dethatch. Okay, so this is a dethatcher. I'm sure you guys have each used one of these. I know we do this from time to time. This is a more severe, more aggressive way of getting rid of the thatch. And it works. It's something that we would recommend only in cases where the thatch is really kind of starting to get out of control and aerating might not be quite enough to get it back under control again. Okay, so this is something where you actually have the spinning blades ripping thatch up out from underneath, and then either with rakes or blowers you blow it off of the surface of the lawn and get rid of it. So in some cases you may have to do this. But if the thatch just gets completely out of control and it's not managed, and it's not aerated, and they don't ever do dethatching or anything like that, then sometimes you just need to cut the whole lawn out and start over again. And that's unfortunate, but I've seen that happen before where people have had thatch layers that have just gotten so out of control. Their best bet was just to rip it out like this, just take a sod cutter, cut it out, start over again. And that's something, so when you think about it, aerating the lawn in the fall, okay, you guys know it's a bigger charge because it takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more energy to be able to do it, takes different equipment, it's cumbersome, but the cost of that compared to the cost of removing your entire yard and starting over again, it's quite a bargain when you think about it. So it really makes a lot more sense to keep on top of it by aerating every year. If you haven't kept on top of it and you catch it in time, you can do a dethatching and then maybe get them on an aerating program. But if it gets completely out of control, sometimes this is your only option. You just got to start over. So that's thatch. Now we're going to move on to temperature. Okay, temperatures are something that we don't have a whole lot of control over, right? So it's one of those things that, now by the way, these handouts that you've got there have more information in them than what I'm giving you up here, and that's great. If you guys have a chance to read through that, it'll give you a little bit more in depth. But temperature, what I want you to keep in mind is that we've got climate zones around the country. And they typically, and it's something that as turfgrass managers and scientists, we've developed this map that's kind of a helpful guide as to what kind of grasses are going to grow well in what parts of the country. And you have different zones. You've got the cool, humid zone, which is where we are. But you've also got the transition zone, which is kind of in the middle, right there. And then you got the warm, humid zone. And as you notice, we're in Connecticut, but we're pretty close to that transition zone. We're kind of on the border almost. But we're in the cool, humid zone, but we're kind of close to the transition zone. Then you have cool, arid. Then this over here, just this little slice over here is kind of like Connecticut in the Northeast, which is why most of the seed that we use is actually grown out here in farms in Oregon right here. Because it's actually the very same climate zone as what we are out here. So it's a good place to grow it. They got a lot of open farmland, they get sort of a good rainfall and everything. It's a good place to farm grass seed. But then you also have the warm, arid zone. So you have different types of grass that are going to grow best in these different zones. Okay? Grasses up here do best, generally speaking, in the temperature range of 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we've all seen, we get through a summer, it's been 85 degrees all summer long, the grass is looking okay. And that's true, the grasses will survive through a summer, 85. They start suffering when you're getting up into the 90s on a regular basis. Okay, but you can get through a summer up into the 80s, not a problem. They'll survive, but they're not going to be as healthy as if the temperature was around 75 degrees all the time. That's when they're really thriving, and that's when it's growing like crazy in the spring, and the grass is just doing really well. What happens when it's too hot? Well, there's different types of grass that can do better or worse. And for where we are, what I've done is kind of listed the main ones that we use. There's more than this. And actually, if you look in your packet, they're going to have more grass varieties listed. I just picked out the ones that we use. And the strongest one by far for the heat, if it gets really hot, is the turf-type tall fescue. Okay, so that's one that you guys know we've got bags of that. We've been using that. On those lawns that really burn out in the summertime, that's probably the best stuff to put down because that's going to handle the heat and even the drought better than the other types of grass. Right after that is Kentucky bluegrass, which does pretty well. That's the sod that we were talking about. It looks real nice and carpet-like. That does pretty well in the summer. It does very well also because it can go dormant very well. And I'm getting off track just a little bit here, but that means that when it gets too hot or too dry, it turns brown. It looks like it's dead, but it's not. It's just going to bounce back again. And then after that, you have the fine fescues, and then you have the perennial ryegrass down at the bottom that has the hardest time with the heat. Now, I talked about why you don't want a pure perennial ryegrass lawn earlier, and this is one of the reasons why, because when it gets really hot out, this is the worst one to have up here. No, not the worst one, but the worst one out of the top 4 good varieties of grass. So you want to get a blend in there. Now, what about if it's too cold? Well, if it's too cold, typically speaking, you've got, in the wintertime, the grass doesn't grow, right? So when it starts getting cold, even the cool season grasses, like what we use, aren't going to grow when it's almost frozen. And you can see even now, even though it hasn't gotten freezing out, the lawns are slowing down significantly in how much they're growing because it's starting to get colder. So when it's too cold, grass will slow down. But cold is really a big problem in the warm season grasses. And so the reason for that is because the warm humid grasses do best in 80 to 95 degree heat. Okay, so those ones do well there. The other ones do well in our temperatures. And who knows what we're looking at here? You guys have all seen this probably 1,000 times. All you guys have been working for us for a few years. Who said it? I heard it.
Crabgrass?
Crabgrass, exactly. That's dead crabgrass. So the reason why crabgrass dies every year in the fall when we get the first frost is because it's a warm season grass that can't handle the cold. So we get the frost and then boom, it's dead. Now this is a unique grass in that it produces a lot of seed. It's an annual, so it produces a lot of seed, and then next year the crabgrass that grows back is from the seed that this stuff left. But at the same time, that's why it doesn't survive through the winter. It's a warm season grass that just can't handle it. When I was down in Bermuda a few years back, probably about 22, 23 years back or something, I remember walking, I was looking at lawns in the area and trying to figure out what they were, and I couldn't figure out what they were. Then I finally figured out it was crabgrass. That they keep crabgrass lawns down in Bermuda year round because it works fine. It doesn't die. But up here, it dies in the fall, and then you're left with nothing but bare dirt and this straw brown stuff. So for too cold, these are some warm season grasses, some of which you might have heard of, some of which you might have seen or dealt with, but some of them can handle the cold a little bit better than the others, just like some of the cool season grasses can handle heat a little better. Okay, so zoysia, you guys have probably noticed that in a lot of lawns, right? You've seen these big areas where in the in the spring, and then in the fall, they're brown, but they survive. They handle the winter. They go dormant. They don't look very good through the winter, but it can handle it. So that's why you're going to see zoysia in lawns up here from time to time. It's not ideal for this area, but it can handle it. Okay? Yeah, and then Bermuda grass is another one you're going to see from time to time. It won't be as aggressive. You're not going to see it nearly as much around here. That's why it's number 2 on the list. But you might see it from time to time, and it's the same kind of thing. In the winter, it's going to be completely brown, and it's going to bounce back again the next year once the weather warms up. Buffalo grass, you probably don't see up here. St. Augustine grass, you probably don't see up here. Neither one of them can handle. They're just going to die when the summer comes. I'm sorry, when the winter comes. Okay, but if you came up here in the heat of the summer and you planted one of these, they would look really good until it got cold in the fall, and then they would die off and be done. Now, we also have cold tolerance levels up here for our grasses, for the cool season grasses, and the most cold tolerant is Kentucky bluegrass. The fine fescues are second, and then the tall fescues third, and then down at the bottom of the list there is perennial ryegrass. Okay, so we got, let's compare the two lists of the grasses that we use up here that we're going to need to know about. What do you see that kind of stands out to you here, something to keep in mind?
Ryegrass is the worst.
Perennial is garbage.
So yeah, those two lit up there. It's actually not. It's a decent type of grass. And I want you guys to keep in mind that these are the top 4, sort of the best 4 varieties of grass we could use up in this part of the country. So anything on this list is okay. But you don't want a lawn that's pure perennial ryegrass. Now the reason a lot of landscapers and even other lawn companies might use that, and they do, a lot of them will use pure perennial ryegrass, is for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's less expensive. And it grows really fast, exactly. So generally speaking, they plant it, it grows in about a week or so, and everybody's happy. And they're planting it in the fall, so the fall weather's nice and moderate. What's that?
I've seen lawns they do that. It looks really thin.
It looks very thin, and why do you think that is?
No stolons or rhizomes.
Right, no stolons or rhizomes or anything to sort of spread and help fill the area in. So you see these complete perennial ryegrass lawns, they're thin because they have no ability to spread. And when it gets too cold or too hot, it dies off. It's not great that way. So I want to caution you, it's not garbage grass. It's good grass, but it's not the best. Okay, it's not the best one. It's good to have as part of the mix in order to keep the thatch a little bit under control. Okay, because again, it doesn't produce the thatch, but when you mix it with Kentucky Blue that produces a lot of thatch, then you end up with a lawn that's kind of moderate. Okay, a little bit of both.
And so it doesn't take too long for the customer to see something too, right?
Well, and that's true too. When you see a mix of those grasses, you're going to see the perennial rye coming up quickly, and that's kind of a good sign. You know right away whether it's getting enough water, what the conditions are, whether or not the area has been seeded well. So it's a good indicator to let you know whether or not the seed is working. But you do want to make sure to keep in mind about a week later, 2 weeks later, you're going to start seeing the Kentucky bluegrass growing in, and that'll really thicken it up.
So, I mean, is there a downside to ever have like a mix of fescue and bluegrass?
No, that's perfectly good. The perennial rye just tends to be a good. It looks very nice, by the way, perennial ryegrass. So that's another thing. It's got a very nice look to it, unless it's purely perennial rye, in which case it can be very thin. Okay, but the reason why we like to mix some of it into the grass seed blends that we use is because it's also there are certain diseases and certain insect problems that are going to attack Kentucky bluegrass. Other ones are going to attack fine fescues. Others are going to attack perennial rye. So if all of a sudden you get certain insect problems or certain disease problems that Kentucky bluegrass is really prone to, okay, a lot of the Kentucky blue might suffer, but if you've got 2 other varieties with the fine fescues and the perennial rye, chances are pretty good that like 2/3 of the lawn is going to be okay. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's good. That's why having a variety of grasses is usually the best way to go. But this is another one, just to kind of keep in mind. That's why I always cringe when we see some of our competitors buying bags of pure perennial ryegrass, which a lot of them do, because, what's that?
It doesn't look at that house in Greenwich, and the landscaper see it with it.
Yeah.
I did the aeration there, but when I went back, I was like, all right, wow, this looks a lot better than it did when I was here before. It's just thin, like Dave said.
Yeah. You got a nice variety of grasses in there.
When you drive on it, it just stays flat. It doesn't really like pop back up. Or
yeah.
It just doesn't do it.
It's not the most vigorous grass either, yeah. So how do you control, we're talking about temperature, right? How can you control temperature? Well, believe it or not, there actually is underground air control systems, but yeah, when you say golf courses, I only know of one that actually does this. So it's Augusta National, which is where they host one of the biggest, the Masters, which is one of the biggest golf tournaments in the world. and they host it once a year, and every golf fan in the world is watching this tournament. This is one of the biggest ones in the world, so they need to make sure that place is top-notch for the cameras, so everybody in the world is watching that golf course. And they do have a system like this where it actually drains out the water when you get too much water, and then when there's no water and it's getting hot outside, you can actually blow cool air into it, and it blows cool air up into the grass. So that's kind of cool. It's also not practical for our use. Okay, this works well because these greens that they use there are very sandy, and so the air is going to blow through it. I imagine it was extremely expensive. Money's no object down there. It's not something that's available for homeowners. It's not something we can take advantage of. It's not something you're ever probably going to see in real life.
Don't you just water your lawn if it's getting too hot? I've done that before.
You can, but if you're that'll help, but that really just cools down. That's a good point, because a lot of people think of that. Oh, it's getting really, really hot out, I'll just water the lawn more. It's a little bit like watering a house plant and then putting it in the oven, then turning the oven on. Because it's at a certain point, it doesn't matter if it's getting water; it's just too hot, right? And so there's a difference between heat and drought, but they are tied together, because when it gets hotter and hotter, it dries out quicker. So you see the two of them sort of going hand in hand a lot. And the watering will cool the grass off, but just temporarily, just for a little bit, like maybe for half an hour to an hour, and then the water kind of soaks in, the sun's beating down, it's still too hot. Okay, and in some cases there's certain diseases that really thrive under hot, wet conditions. Pythium, okay, brown patch, there's a few like that. So if you water too much in the heat to try to keep the lawn cool, you could be causing disease problems. So really, my question is this: would you guys ever expect to see a palm tree up here in Connecticut? Have you ever? This is a palm tree that you see down in Florida. Well, exactly, if it's in a pot. But this tree, I'm guessing, is probably not long for this world after getting snowed on like this. Chances are pretty good it's not going to be doing too well. Okay, so the palm trees are not well suited for Connecticut. And that's one of the reasons you really don't see them up here anymore. Interestingly, while I was Googling for this picture, I found there's actually a company that does palm tree installation in Connecticut, Connecticut Palm. If you can imagine that, yeah. Wow. They don't, but what they do is they bring them in pots, and they basically, I don't know the exact business model, I think they either lease them to the people for the season or whatever, and they come out with these nice big pots, and they put palm trees up around your yard, and then at the fall, about this time of year, they go collect them again and they bring them to a greenhouse where they stay for the winter. But you can't keep them planted in your yard year round. They're going to die in the wintertime. So the point is, you don't want to you want to be very careful about what you're choosing. And when we talk about controlling temperature, you can't control the temperature, but you can control the grass that you're using. And so just like you want to pick the right kind of tree, maple trees, certain pine trees that do well in this part of the country for up here, and then you want palm trees and other things down in Florida and Texas, okay, you want to pick the right kinds of grasses for the zone where you live. So Kentucky bluegrass, great one up here, tall fescue, actually more of a transition zone grass. That's why when we were looking at the slides earlier, the tall fescue was at the top of the list for the ones that can handle the heat the best, at least for our area. That's because it's really more of a transition zone grass, but since we're so close to the transition zone, it tends to do well up here as well. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why tall fescue is great for this area. And then things like zoysia grass or even Bermuda or St. Augustine down below. So you can't control the temperature, but you can control the type of grass that you're using. And you can control other cultural factors too, like make sure they got plenty of topsoil and stuff like that. Those are all things we're going to go into in future sessions. So, and that's it. So thatch and temperature, two things that we don't really treat for, but it's good to understand why we're doing things the way we're doing them, so that you can hopefully optimize the lawn by keeping excess thatch under control and by making sure you have the right grass varieties for the right temperature zone.